The story of British art is a complex and fascinating epic. But if you want to know the truth, for many years, our European counterparts considered this island in the North Sea to be a bit of a backwater.
Up until the beginning of the 17th century, Britain didn't produce one single painter of international fame. Nothing much happened in British painting for a very long time. It was culturally a little bit insecure.
It wasn't until 1611, when William Dobson was born in London, that an actual British painter of any note was produced here.
These are some of the earliest surviving portraits of English kings, but the artist is unknown, and almost certainly not from this island.
This portrait of Richard III was actually painted more than a century after his death in 1485. We could produce writers like Shakespeare, but British portraiture is a bit behind the times. It's still medieval in spirit.
These portraits behave like legal documents. They certify lineage, rank, royalty.
The sitter appears timeless, untouched by doubt, emotion, or physical frailty. But it's not brilliant, is it? It's all a bit, well, stiff. The idea of painting a person as an individual with psychological presence has barely arrived in this country at that time. Faces are outlined, the light is flat, bodies are rigid, frontal, hands are awkward.
This incredible painting, The Ambassadors, was painted by Hans Holbein in 1533. But he wasn't British at all. He was from the continent, from Augsburg, and he painted at the court of Henry VIII.
If we compare it to what was happening on the Italian peninsula at the same time in, say, Venice, Titian was painting some of the greatest works of art the world had ever seen.
Titian was showing us that paint can carry real emotion. This painting here was painted in 1510, Man with a Quilted Sleeve.
It sets a benchmark for the heights that paintings can reach in European art. But if we compare it to what's going on in Britain at the same time, it's still painfully provincial.
But enter Charles I, a king who had a vision for British art.
Before he was made king, Charles travelled to Spain in 1623 and saw the great continental collections and understood the European idea that a ruler could be made immortal through paint.
He was quiet, refined, and obsessed with art. He understood that portraiture wasn't just image making, it was real power. It was statecraft.
Charles actually suffered from rickets when he was a child, and so he was small and physically awkward. He worried endlessly about how he appeared. He needed an artist with European sensibilities, someone who could translate monarchy into real, tangible visual power.
In 1632, he lured Anthony Van Dyck to England, promising him a pension, a knighthood, a gold chain worth £200, and an apartment in one of his palaces. All the trimmings. Charles suddenly looked tall, noble, unshakable.
Van Dyck had trained under Peter Paul Rubens, one of the greatest artists of the age, and was considered his heir and the best painter in Europe. The British nobility couldn't get enough of him. He transformed how they saw themselves, not as these rigid people of state, but individuals with identity and personality.
The British painters become masters not of saints or gods, like they were in Rome, painting the popes, but of characters, of social status. He could paint as easily as you and I breathe. There's a famous story of nobles queuing up to be Van Dycked.
He was the first superstar of British art. He introduced fluid brushwork and a technical ability that had never been seen before.
Van Dyck didn't even train students formally, but he trained an entire culture by example. He died in 1641 at the age of 42 in the area of London called Blackfriars.
Painters all over Britain began copying his style and technique, and this created a revolution in British art, the birth of the British school. And by the 18th century, this small island led Europe in painting. Reynolds theorizes it, Gainsborough emotionalizes it, Hogarth satirizes it, but that lineage begins with Van Dyck and a king who understood that power must be seen before it is believed. And here's the tragic irony, the cold, brutal fate of King Charles I, who built this glistening visual culture. One bitterly cold Tuesday in 1649, he walked through the banqueting hall at Whitehall Palace, his residence in Westminster. The room lavishly decorated with a group of 9 glistening paintings by Peter Paul Rubens, commissioned by the king 2 decades prior. He must have looked at these while walking to his execution. They would have been some of the last things he ever saw. And at about 2 p.m, King Charles put his head on a block after saying a prayer and signaled to the executioner when he was ready by stretching out his hands. He was then beheaded in one clean stroke. The king lost his head, but Van Dyck's portraits live on and are here in all their glory still today. After the execution, his magnificent art collection was brutally dispersed in the Commonwealth sale. Masterpieces sold off for a fraction of their worth, scattered all across Europe. A Titian painting was even given to the king's plumber, John Embry, to settle a debt. St. Margaret triumphing over the devil. Embry chose it among other paintings in lieu of £903 he was owed for palace repairs. The dispersal of the king's collection was one of the greatest losses in our cultural history.
British art went from stiff, decorative likeness to a tradition of psychological portraiture that still defines British art today.
This small island in the North Sea still produces some of the greatest portrait painters in the last 100 years.
All because one Flemish painter taught an island how to look at itself through the mastery of his brush.